If you were a teenager 30,000 years ago, you wouldn't be worrying about homework, or awkward first dates, or what to post online. By the time you were 13, you might already be expected to hunt large animals, help deliver a baby, or be married with a child of your own on the way. There was no such thing as being a teenager the way we think of it today. No in-between phase where you're not quite a kid, but not quite an adult either. In most of human history, that gap barely existed. You went from childhood almost straight into adult responsibility, often with your life expectancy already halfway over. So what was it actually like to be young, not a child, but not yet fully grown in the world our ancestors lived in? Let's dig into what being a teenager actually meant for most of human history. Here's the first surprising fact. The very idea of the teenager as a distinct life stage, with its own culture, its own identity, its own extended period of semi-independence before adulthood, is a remarkably recent invention. Historians generally trace the modern concept of the teenager to the early to mid-20th century, tied closely to the rise of mandatory schooling, child labor laws, and a growing consumer market aimed specifically at young people. This doesn't mean ancient teenagers didn't exist biologically. Puberty is a universal human process, and the physical and hormonal changes of adolescence happen just as they do today. What's different is that ancient societies rarely treated this stage as a prolonged semi-protected transition period. Instead, many cultures marked it with a sharp, deliberate line, a ceremony, a task, or a milestone that symbolically and practically converted a child into an adult almost overnight. Many ancient and traditional societies developed formal rites of passage specifically designed to mark this transition, and these rituals tell us a lot about what was expected of young people at this stage of life. In many hunter-gatherer societies, studied by anthropologists, a boy's transition to manhood was often tied directly to a successful hunt, sometimes requiring him to kill a specific, often dangerous animal alone, as proof of readiness for adult responsibility. Failure could mean being sent back to try again, sometimes for years, while success meant immediate recognition as an adult member of the group, with all the responsibilities and risks that came with it. For girls in many of these same societies, the marker was often tied to the first menstrual cycle, which was frequently treated as a significant, sometimes ritualized event, after which a girl might be considered ready for marriage and motherhood. Some of the most well-documented examples come from Southern African and Australian Aboriginal traditions, where initiation ceremonies for both boys and girls involved extended periods of separation from the community, instruction in adult skills and cultural knowledge, and sometimes physically demanding trials meant to test endurance, pain tolerance, and self-control, all skills considered essential for adult survival in these environments. In many ancient agricultural societies, the markers shifted somewhat, tied less to a single dramatic test and more to a young person's ability to perform adult-level physical labor. Historical records and archaeological evidence from places like ancient Egypt and Rome suggest that children as young as 12 or 13 were already expected to work substantially, whether in the fields, in a trade, or in domestic labor, with the line between child and young adult worker being blurry at best. By modern standards, one of the most striking differences is just how early many young people took on roles we now associate firmly with adulthood, particularly marriage and parenthood. In many historical societies, including ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and numerous medieval European cultures, it was not unusual for girls to be married in their early to mid-teens, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, particularly among the upper classes where marriage was often tied to family alliances and inheritance rather than romantic choice. Boys, by contrast, often married somewhat later, commonly in their late teens to early 20s, partly because they needed time to establish the economic means to support a household. This wasn't necessarily viewed as controversial or exploitative within these societies the way it would be understood today. It reflected a different set of assumptions about readiness for adulthood, shaped heavily by shorter life expectancies and the economic necessity of establishing a family and household early. Life expectancy itself is a crucial piece of this puzzle. In many ancient and medieval populations, average life expectancy at birth was often in the 30s, heavily skewed downward by extremely high infant and child mortality. If you survived childhood, your realistic remaining lifespan was often considerably longer than that headline number, but the pressure to reach adult milestones quickly was very real. There simply wasn't the luxury of a long, extended adolescence when a full life might only span 40 or 50 years, and when physical labor was often essential to a family's survival. Teenagers in ancient farming and herding societies would often be responsible for substantial portions of the household's economic output, tending livestock, working fields, weaving, or apprenticing in a trade. Well before what we'd now consider working age, 14-year-old wasn't seen as someone who needed protecting from adult responsibility. They were seen as someone who was, for all practical purposes, already most of the way to being a fully contributing adult. Here's where the story gets genuinely fascinating from a biological standpoint. Compared to most other mammals, humans have an unusually long period of development between childhood and full physical and reproductive maturity, and evolutionary biologists have spent a lot of time trying to figure out why. Many primates reach reproductive maturity fairly directly after childhood, without much of a distinct in-between growth phase. Humans, by contrast, go through a distinctive adolescent growth spurt, along with a prolonged period of brain development, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, the region associated with planning, impulse control, and complex decision-making, that continues well into a person's early to mid-20s. One leading hypothesis, sometimes called the adaptive learning or extended childhood hypothesis, suggests that this drawn-out developmental period exists because human survival depends so heavily on learned skills, tool-making, social cooperation, language, and cultural knowledge that simply take longer to master than the physical maturity of the body would otherwise require. In other words, human bodies may be biologically ready for reproduction earlier than human brains and social skill sets are ready. For the full complexity of adult life, this creates an interesting tension that likely existed for ancient teenagers just as much as it does today. A body that is biologically and physically capable of adult tasks, hunting, physical labor, even reproduction, paired with a brain that is still very much in the process of fine-tuning judgment, risk assessment, and long-term planning. Some researchers argue this is part of why adolescence, across many cultures and even in some other social mammals, tends to be associated with heightened risk-taking behavior. It may reflect a genuinely still developing capacity for weighing long-term consequences, not simply a lack of discipline. This means ancient teenagers likely faced a strange and difficult position, expected by necessity to perform as capable adults in a harsh and demanding world. While their brains were still going through the same developmental process modern teenage brains go through today. The dangerous hunts, the early marriages, the abrupt shift into adult responsibility, all of this happened to young people whose neurological development for weighing risk and consequence may not have been meaningfully different from a teenager's brain today. The archaeological and fossil record offers some remarkable direct glimpses into the physical lives of ancient teenagers. Skeletal remains of adolescents from various prehistoric sites often show clear evidence of significant physical labor and strain at a young age. Signs of repetitive stress on bones and joints consistent with heavy carrying, tool use, or intensive physical activity well before full skeletal maturity, which in humans isn't complete until the early to mid-20s. Burial sites also offer clues. In some cases, the burial goods and grave treatment given to adolescent remains, weapons, tools, jewelry, or ceremonial items suggest that the individual had already achieved some recognized adult or near-adult status within their community by the time of their death, reinforcing the idea that the transition to adult identity often happened well before what we would now consider full physical or emotional maturity. So what were ancient human teenagers actually like? In many ways, they were caught in the exact same biological tension modern teenagers experience, bodies capable of adult tasks, brains still finishing the long process of learning to navigate risk, judgment, and complex social decision-making. The difference is that ancient societies, out of sheer necessity, didn't give that in-between phase much room to exist. There was no extended, semi-protected adolescence, the way most of the world understands it today, just a rapid, often ritualized, push directly into adult responsibility, adult labor, and sometimes adult family life. Often occurring at ages we would now still very much consider childhood. The awkward, uncertain, risk-taking phase of being a teenager is likely a very old and very deep part of human biology. But the idea of teenagers having their own extended semi-independent life stage, free from full adult responsibility, is almost entirely a modern invention. For nearly all of human history, you were still becoming yourself neurologically, while already being expected to live, work, and sometimes raise a family. So the next time being a teenager feels like an awkward, in-between kind of chaos, it turns out that feeling itself might be ancient. What's actually new is that we finally started giving people room to go through it.